Well, hello, Foothills family. We are continuing our journey through the Gospel of John, and today we're going to be camping out on chapter 9. And if you haven't read the chapter yet, why don't you just pause the video right now, go read the chapter, and come on back. I'll be waiting here for you. You know, as the chapter begins, Jesus is asked a question, and the question comes from his disciples. And the disciples ask him, who caused or what caused the blindness in this man who is blind from birth? Was it something that he did, or was it something that somebody else did? And Jesus responded by saying that it was neither, but so that the works of God may be displayed. You know, human nature really hasn't changed very much in 2,000 years. There's still a tendency to try to place some blame or some explanation on something when it happens tragically. In Jesus' era, there were Jews that actually believed that a person could get punished for a sin that was committed while the person was in the womb. There was actually people that also believed in reincarnation, and they said that if there was a physical ailment, it must have been because of a sin that they had committed in a previous life. You know, my wife Vicki and I experienced something similar when we had our firstborn child, Joshua, which many of you guys know was born with Down syndrome. And we had a family acquaintance that came up and told Vicki that she must have committed some sin, and the Lord was punishing her by giving her a Down syndrome boy. Now, we know that some birth defects could be due to irresponsible behavior during the pregnancy, but most of the birth defects are the result of some consequence from the fall in the garden and are totally out of our control. Jesus' response was very clear to his disciples. He said, don't waste your time on theological issues or debates on why or something happened. In the midst of trials and circumstances, God wants to do a work that will bring glory to him, and we must do the works as well. In a recent message, Pastor Mark said that instead of asking why when things happen, we should be asking how and what. How can I glorify God in this situation? And what grace has God given me to overcome it? You know, I want to thank God for Foothills Christian Church. 20 years or so ago, they started a ministry here for developmentally disabled adults. And they wanted to go and extend the love and the grace of Jesus Christ to developmentally disabled adults. And I thank God for people like Kathy Sparks and Gaynell Merriweather and all the folks that came before them. When they saw the developmentally disabled adults, they didn't try to figure out why it happened, but they rolled up their sleeves and they made a commitment to do the works of God and extend grace, love, and compassion to these adults. And I really thank God for their service. Moving into verse 6 and 7, Jesus took a little bit of dirt, took a little bit of spit, and he placed it on the blind man's eye, and then he instructed him to go and wash in the pool of Siloam. Now, you got to admit, that's a pretty strange prescription for healing. But the blind man didn't sit there and wait, and the blind man didn't try to rub the mud out of his eyes. He could have, but instead he stepped out in faith, and he followed the instructions of Jesus, even though they were a little bit weird. He followed through, and he received a complete healing. You know, sometimes we need to step out in faith to complete the work of God. Often when God starts something in our lives, we have some responsibility to complete the process. Let's just say a prophetic guy comes into church and he prophesies over you and says, in the future, you are going to have a teaching ministry. What should your response be? Well, actually, you probably would have two responses. One would be you just sit back and wait for it to happen. Or the second response would be you respond in faith, you pray and you ask the Lord, if this is your plan for me, what do I need to do to prepare to step into that plan? Your part of the completion would be maybe starting as an apprentice at a home group and learning how to do a Bible study. Or maybe take some classes, maybe enroll in Bible college. Just study the Bible more. The point is that when we respond in faith, we partner with God in seeing his purposes fulfilled in our lives. As we move on in chapter 9, we see that once the man was healed, he had several opportunities to share what happened to him. In verses 8 through 25, he had the opportunity to share how Jesus healed him with his neighbors and twice with the Pharisees. Jesus' touch changed this man, and he was not shy about sharing his testimony. We all have a testimony of what Jesus has done in our lives. We all have a story about how Jesus healed us, how Jesus delivered us, how Jesus saved us, how Jesus rescued us. The blind man's story is a reminder to all of us that we should always be prepared to share our testimony. Our personal testimonies are powerful. As the blind man said at the end of verse 25, he said, "This one thing that I do know, I was blind, and now I see." No one can do your testimony for you, not even your parents. In fact, in verses 18 through 21, the Pharisees reached out to the blind man's parents because they wanted an explanation from them how the blind man was healed. And they deferred to the man. Only he could share what Jesus did in his life. So prepare your testimony, practice your testimony, be ready to give it. You never know what opportunities are going to come up. You never know what audience you're going to have where you can share the love and the grace and the healing that God has done in your life with other people. Well, in verses 24 through 34, it got a little bit rougher for the former blind man. He went head to head with the Pharisees about Jesus, and it ended up by him paying a very great price. He took a stand for Jesus, and he was expelled from the synagogue. Never forget that when you make a stand for Jesus, you can expect opposition and perhaps even get some kind of negative consequence. This man was brave to speak the truth about Jesus, even if it risked him being expelled from the synagogue. This was a pretty serious punishment. It was more than just being told that you couldn't go to church anymore. If you were expelled from a synagogue, you basically lost all connections and all relationships. It was as if you were a leper. Remember that taking a stand for Jesus could cause division in your family. It could potentially maybe affect a promotion at work. It may cause friends to ostracize you. Following Jesus does come with a cost. Remember, our leader Jesus said in John 15:18 that if they hate you, it's because they hated him first. But don't let this cause you to be afraid. There is a reward for standing up for Christ. Let's look at what happened to the former blind man. After he was expelled from the synagogue, Jesus searched him out, and he rewarded him with a greater revelation of who he was. Let me read verse 35 through 38 to you. And Jesus heard that he had been put out, and finding him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" And the blind man answered, "Who is he, Lord, that I may believe in him?" And Jesus said to him, "You have both seen him, and he is the one who is talking with you." And the blind man said, "Lord, I believe." And he worshiped him. It was interesting that when the blind man was interrogated by the Pharisees in verse 17, the blind man only could claim and can only declare that he knew Jesus as a prophet. But in just a few hours, he went from being a prophet in this man's eyes to being God, worthy of worship. In the midst of this persecution, Jesus revealed more of who he was to this blind man. And that should be very encouraging for us. There's a special fellowship that a believer experiences when facing suffering or facing persecution in the cause of Christ. Our big brother Jesus is there with us in the midst of all of us, and he gives us a greater grace and a greater revelation of who he is. Well, folks, that's it for today. I'm really looking forward to hearing what Pastor Neil has to say about John 10. May the Lord bless you, and we'll see you next time.